Hello, this is Dr. Mandic. Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy, and we are going to continue our discussions of metaphysics. We're in our metaphysics unit. So far, we've talked about the metaphysics of space and questions about whether space is infinite and the related question of whether motion is possible, and motion is a kind of change. Change came up again when we talked about the metaphysics of time, and we discussed whether time itself is the sort of thing that changed. In all these instances, we're looking at very basic aspects of existence like space and time, and we're asking about, from a philosophical point of view, what fundamentally is going on there. What does it mean for space to exist, or what does it mean for there to be motion? So, metaphysics is a branch of philosophy in which we try to get at the most basic or fundamental questions concerning existence and the sorts of things that exist and what their nature is, and how we can know about it in a rational way, how reason can shed light on it. Change, which was a big deal in both the discussion of motion from the space unit and the discussion of time from our time unit, is going to come up again. We're going to be talking about change yet again. In this video, we're going to be focusing on two sorts of thing or two sorts of entity. Material objects, that's one sort of entity, material objects. Things that are made out of matter, like, for example, a rubber duck or an umbrella. What sometimes gets called medium-sized dry goods. Just everyday regular objects like a guitar or a toilet or a chair or a tree. These are things made out of matter. They're made out of parts, and they change. You can paint them, you could whittle them, you could put some, put a doily on it, throw a blanket over it. These are all sorts of ways in which they can change. And almost all material objects have parts. Specifically, they have spatial parts. They have the left half and the right half. They have the top and the bottom. And these aspects of material objects, that they change, they can be changed, and also that they are made out of parts, give rise to a lot of really weird puzzles when we try to give a metaphysical account of the nature of their existence. So we're going to be getting into some of those puzzles that have to do with the existence of material objects, puzzles that arise when we think about how and whether they change, and also the relationship between their parts and the whole of which the parts make up. The material objects are constituted by their parts. We might say the material objects are complex. They are complexes, and they are composed of their relative simples. So take, for example, a car. A car has all sorts of different parts, like the oil filter and the steering wheel and the drive shaft and the valve stems and the crankshaft. These are all different parts. And so relative to the whole car, those things are relatively simple, but they're not absolutely simple because they themselves have parts. The wheel has the tire, and the tire has the different nubs and grooves on it, and the little valve stem that you need to attach the air pump to. Those are the different parts of the tire, and even the valve stem is made out of parts. So there's lots of parts, and you might say, whatever, I mean, this is kid stuff, everyone knows about parts. But welcome to philosophy. You think about the simplest thing, and it gets super complicated, and it makes your head explode. And that's not all. We're not just going to make your head explode thinking about rubber ducks and umbrellas. We're also going to be thinking about people themselves. People are a very, very important topic to us because we are people, and we care about us. We care about one another. And there's some really weird puzzles that arise when you think about people having parts and people changing. Special puzzles that arise because they are people. So this video is going to be roughly divided into two parts. The first is going to be about the material objects and the problems of material constitution. And then the second part, which is probably the bigger and most important part, is the one about persons or people. And we're going to be talking about something called personal identity and the philosophical topic of survival. You might say, survival, that sounds like an important topic. I'm interested in many things, but one of them that I'm most interested in is surviving. You may not think about it, but it's a really big deal. Surviving. A lot goes into it. You got to get the right amount of oxygen, or else it's not happening. But those are medical issues about survival, like whether the patient had enough oxygen. Um, but there are metaphysical issues about survival. Like, is it even possible for a person to be the same person at different moments in time? Is it possible for people to survive change? And you might say, well, obviously it's possible, shut up. Or you might say, no, once you start thinking about it, you realize that you literally are a different person if you change. And it doesn't have to be a major change, it could just be a minor change. That any change is actually resulting in two different people. You might say, that is really weird. Is this just a class about weird things? And the answer is yes, it is. Yes, it is. But they're also important things too. Okay, let's get into our problems of material constitution. And you might say, wait a minute, Mandic, that's a person there. They're bleeding from their leg stump. I thought we were going to save persons for later. Well, one interesting thing about people, at least most of them, is that they have bodies, and bodies are material objects. A body is a material object. And there's all sorts of weird questions we could raise about the relationship between a person and the material object, which is their body. One version of this is the mind-body problem. What's the relationship between your mind, a person's mind? Perhaps the most important part of a person is their mind. Perhaps a person just is their mind. What's the relationship between a mind and material object, which is their physical body? And we're going to have a whole unit on that later on in this class. We're going to have several lectures about the mind-body problem stuff. But we're going to be interested in, right now, problems of material composition, where we're dealing with entities. It could be a table or a chair, or it could be a human body that have parts. What is the relationship between the whole and its parts? And is it something that can be rationally understood? Or is it somehow like mystical or mysterious or permanently contradictory and confusing? So there's three classical cases that we're going to look at. One of them is called the ship of Theseus, the ship of Theseus. The other one is the story of Dion and Theon. And then the third one is one that we've talked about a little bit already in one of the first videos in this course, the Sorites paradox, or the puzzle of the heap. Let's start with the ship of Theseus. So the ship of Theseus was a ship, and it was made out of parts. That's basically all you need to know. You might say, that's it? That's all you got, Mandic? Well, there's a little more to it than that. Suppose you slowly, over many, many days, maybe even years, started replacing the parts of this ship, the ship of Theseus. So like on Monday, you take out this part right here. And what do you do with the part that you take? Well, you just go put it in storage somewhere for later. You don't destroy it. You just save it. You take it off and you replace it with something that looks and acts the same as the original part. It's just as good from the point of view of keeping the ship afloat. We haven't done anything that would prevent this ship from floating. You're just taking little parts at a time. So even if you're going to take a part out from the bottom of the boat, you do things to make sure the boat doesn't sink while you're replacing that part. But over a gradual amount of time, we have taken all the parts out of the ship of Theseus and replaced them. Now, here's a question. Suppose you have this ship, the ship of Theseus. If you took out this part right here and replaced it, would it still be a ship? You might say, yeah, it's still a ship. Okay, here's another question. Is it still that ship? Is it still the same ship? And you might say, well, it's obviously not the same. It used to have this one part, now it's got a different part. Yeah, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not asking whether it's exactly similar to the previous ship. I'm asking whether one and the same ship can have one of its parts replaced, right? So suppose I were to comb my hair and get all the hair off my forehead. So I am different than I was before. I have changed my hair, but I'm still one and the same person. Mandic with his hair up in a man bun is one and the same person as Mandic with his hair uh, down into his eyes. It's still the same person. So has Mandic changed? Yeah, Mandic has changed. Has he changed into a different person? Is he now like some other person? Most people would grant no, he's not some other person. So you might think about this in terms of like obligations, bring ethics into it. Um, I have been married for many years, and I take my wedding vows very seriously, and I don't get out of my obligations to my spouse just because I go like this with my hair. I don't get to say like, oh, I'm not the guy that promised those things to you. I'm a different guy. You don't get to say that. So you might say it's just part of our common sense understanding of ourselves, especially as selves situated in certain social networks with networks of obligations to one another, that we can be the same despite changing in relatively minor ways. And one of the things that we're interested in, at least a lot of us, is objects that we own. Some of them are really cool objects like guitars or cars. And once in a while, something will break and you got to replace it, or you want to maybe upgrade it. It wasn't broken, but you want to get a better, tuning peg on your guitar. You want to get a better steering wheel on your car. Or maybe you want to get like a better main mast on your ship. So you replace the parts. Isn't it obvious that you can have one of the same ship, but you replace its parts? Yeah, you might say, yes, it is. So suppose this ship is made out of 1,000 parts. And first, on the day one, you replace the first part. And on day two, you replace the second part. And on day three, you replace the third part. And each time you replace one of the parts, you save the original part. You put it in a warehouse somewhere. Or you put the different parts in different warehouses. But you're saving them. Okay. After 1,000 days, every part in the original ship of Theseus has been replaced by a replacement part. Would you still have a ship? You might say, yes, you still have a ship. Now, what if you took the original parts and built them into a ship? How many ships do you have? You might say, well, I would have 2 ships. There's this one. And then there's the one that I made when I went to the warehouses and got the old parts and put them back together again. There's that one. Question, which one is the ship of Theseus? Are they both the ship of Theseus? Is only the one made out of the all original parts the ship of Theseus? Well, if that's true, if only the one made out of the original parts is the ship of Theseus, then you cannot take the ship of Theseus and replace its parts. You can't say that this is the ship of Theseus, even though it doesn't have any of its original parts. The ship of Theseus just is identical to its original parts. But that's kind of strange. You might say, yeah, sure, you can replace some of the parts and still have the ship of Theseus. And maybe you could replace all of the parts and still have the same ship of Theseus. And by the way, just to foreshadow the relationship between some of this stuff about material constitution of ordinary objects to people, aren't you made out of parts? And isn't one of the things that you do, whether you know it or not, is that every 7 years, every molecule, every cell in your body has been replaced? Some of you knew this. You've heard about this already. You know, like, part of the point of food is to give you energy, but another part of the point of food is to help your body rebuild itself. Just like a car or a ship, things break and they need to be replaced. And that's, sorry to be gross, but that's kind of the point of poop, is to get rid of the broken down cells, the tissues that are constantly breaking down. Food is not just about getting energy. Food is also about getting raw materials to rebuild the ship, the vehicle that is you. And scientists say that every 7 years, you have gone through the full replacement procedure. So it's like what we took 1,000 days to do with the ship of Theseus. We replaced all of its parts. For a human being, it takes 7 years to replace all of the parts. And you might say, well, I am a student in philosophy class. I'm like 21 years old. I've been through this 7 times. I am almost, I'm sorry, you've been through it 3 times. I've been through it 7 times. I'm sneaking up on 49 years old, believe it or not. And so I will have been through this 7 times. And you might say, right, yeah, sure, you're old, Mandic. We get it. You've been through it 7 times. But another view is I've never been through it at all. Those 7 times that the molecules got replaced were 7 different people. Just like 2 different ships of Theseus, 7 different Pete Mandics. One of the Pete Mandics was like a little kid, and the other one was a teenager, and the other one was a young adult, and the other one was this old guy that's teaching this class right now. So that's the puzzle. How can one thing survive the replacement of all its parts, or can it? Are we committed to saying then that there's actually 2 ships, only one of which is the ship of Theseus? Or would you say something else? Would you say that the ship of Theseus, after you've gone through this procedure, the ship of Theseus can be 2 different places at once? Is that an inviting option? Okay, let's move on to our next example. We said we're going to have 3 cases, 3 puzzle cases. We've finished discussing the ship of Theseus. Let's now talk about Dion and Theon. Okay, so here is Dion. You might say, well, Dion looks like I guess an adult male. Can't tell, probably can't tell a lot about Dion. Dion is cast in shadow. I can't really see whether he's got eyes or nose, but I can tell he's got arms and legs. 2 arms, 2 legs. That's a Dion. All right. An adult male with 2 arms, 2 legs. Now, I want you to meet another thing, another entity. It is Theon. You might say, wait a minute, what? Theon? We chopped off Dion's leg and you're calling him Theon now? No. Let me put it like this. Dion has a bunch of different parts, right? So one part of Dion is Dion's head. And if you wanted to, you could call that part, you could call it Dion's head, or you could call that part George, or you could call it part number 1. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's a part. And then there's like his left hand, this is right hand, etc. Well, here's a part of Dion. That's the whole of Dion, and here is just one of Dion's parts. And we could describe this part of Dion as all of Dion except for Dion's left leg. We could call that part number 82, or we could call that part 12. We could call it Larry. We call it Theon. Let's call it Theon because it rhymes with Dion. All right, so there's Theon. All right. There's Dion. Who's Dion? Dion is an adult male with 2 arms and 2 legs. And Dion has a bunch of parts, like most of us, he has parts. And there's one of Dion's parts, call it Theon. Theon is basically everything minus the leg. And here is Dion and Theon. Isn't that right? Aren't you looking at a picture of Dion? There's Dion. There's Dion again, and we've drew a little blue line on Dion's legs so you know where Theon leaves off and the rest of Dion begins. Okay, so we've got Dion and Theon, and Theon is one of Dion's parts. Okay, now imagine this. Imagine we cut off Dion's leg right at the blue line. And then we throw it in a volcano or something like that, or we feed it to an alligator, or we put it in a blender and we sell it as an energy drink. I don't know. I don't care. But Dion lost his leg. That's a thing that happens to people, right? That they lose their leg. And here's another thing that happens to people, and this is actually pretty good news, is most of them, they survive losing their leg. I wouldn't recommend losing your leg if you could avoid it. But, if that happens, on the bright side, you still exist. You still live, right? You could survive that. I got my appendix removed, and I'm still me. My dad got his finger ripped off in a really bad work accident in the 70s, but he's still my dad. Um, and Dion got his leg cut off and thrown into a volcano or fed to an alligator or something like that. Or maybe they fed his leg to an alligator and then they threw the alligator into a volcano. But here's a question. What happened to Theon? What happened to Theon? I mean, Dion could get his leg cut off and still survive, but where's Theon? Does Theon still exist? You might say, yes, Theon still exists. But here's a weird thing. If Dion still exists and Theon still exists, then Dion and Theon are material entities that exist in all and only the same spatial regions. You've got two different physical objects taking up exactly the same space. And you might say, oh, that's a problem. That's a problem. Part of the difference between one person and two people is the difference between whether you're taking up two spaces versus one. You can't have two people in exactly the same space. We could be in the same room. We could even be in really nearby regions, but you can't have someone exactly occupying all and only the same spatial regions that I'm occupying. That's not two different people. And you might say that's generally true of material objects. Like I could have two very, very, very similar pencils really, really close together, but you can't have them in exactly the same space at the same time, right? That's just how material objects work. So you might say that if Dion survives getting his leg cut off, then Theon stops existing. But now that's weird, because if you think about Theon, you didn't do anything to Theon. Theon is just there. Theon didn't get Theon's leg cut off. Theon only has one leg, and it's this leg. And we didn't cut that one off. We didn't do anything at all to Theon. So why would that cause Theon to stop existing? And you might say, oh, okay, then it's Dion that stopped existing. But now you're committed to the view that no one can survive getting their leg cut off, and that seems like a really weird view. That would mean I didn't survive getting my appendix removed. I'm actually some other person. There was a guy that used to have an appendix, and then he stopped existing when he got it removed, and now there's this guy, the one that's talking to you. That is really weird. What are we supposed to do about the puzzle of Dion and Theon? And one suggestion that we're going to get into a little bit later when we talk about personal identity, and maybe the right way to think about Dion and Theon is that a person is not a three-dimensional object. A person is a four-dimensional entity, something that exists not just in a single moment, but they exist over time. And if you look over time at Theon and Dion, you end up with these different entities. Dion used to have two legs. Theon never did have two legs. Theon only ever had one leg. So there are differences between Dion and Theon. One way to put it is in terms of a B theory. Remember in our previous lecture we talked about A theories and B theories. Think about a B theory like eternalism or four-dimensionalism. And one version of that would say that what Dion and Theon aren't three-dimensional objects that are wholly present in a single moment. Instead, they are four-dimensional objects, aka four-dimensional space-time worms. And these are two different space-time worms that occupy different, somewhat overlapping, but still distinct regions of a single four-dimensional space-time loaf. And a little bit later, we're going to see a video. Like a little bit later in this video, we're going to watch a little smaller video about the space-time loaf, which is the four-dimensional space-time structure. Let's talk about another puzzle or problem case involving material constitution. This is something that we were exposed to earlier, one of the first videos in this lecture series, and that's the puzzle of the heap. Which sometimes gets referred to the Sorites paradox. In one version of this, you could talk about grains of sand forming a heap of sand, or you could do it in terms of other stuff. We could talk about like whether someone is bald. I am not bald. I have hair. Maybe someday I will have gone completely bald, but it's so far so good. Not bald. Nothing against bald people, but I'm enjoying having hair. And I might pluck one hair out and still wouldn't be bald, and I would pluck another hair out. I still wouldn't be bald. But if I keep on going, eventually I will be bald. If I were to pluck all of my hairs out, I would be bald. And if I were to pluck all but one, I mean, if I only had one hair, even if it was a really long hair that I like wrapped all the way around my head, and it'd still be bald. I'd just be wearing a weird hair hat. But I would still be bald if I only had one hair, if I only had two hairs, if I only had three hairs. So we could put the point in terms of being bald, whether you're bald versus not bald, and removing one hair or adding one hair. Or we could put it in terms of the original example about grains of sand. If I have just one grain of sand, that's not a heap. If I add one grain of sand, that won't make a heap. If I had a heap, let's say 1,000 grains of sand, and that's obviously a heap, and I remove one, I still have a heap. And you might say if I remove two, I had 998, I'd still have a heap. So we start over on this end with the heap, and I may remove one, remove another one, remove another one. Each of those first few steps, I still have a heap. If I go all the way on the other end, I've got just one grain of sand. That's not a heap. 2 grains, that's not a heap either. 3 grains, frankly, I don't think 3 grains of sand is enough to have a heap. So you might say, somewhere in here, you have to go from there being no heap to there being a heap. But wait a minute. If that's true, then there's some one point in that number line where you just add 1 grain of sand and you get a heap. And you subtract 1 grain of sand and you go from a heap to a non-heap. But that doesn't seem plausible. It doesn't seem like there's any point in the series where you get a sharp cutoff between there being a heap versus not a heap. So what the heck are we supposed to do about this? You might say there's no objective fact that would distinguish the heaps from the non-heaps. The objective facts have to do with things like how many grains of sand are there and counting them. There's 1 grain of sand, or there's 2, or there's 554. There's no objective demarcation between, say, 554 and 555, which would define whether you have a heap or not. So it's tempting then to say there are no heaps, or heaps exist, but they only exist in the mind. Heaps are a kind of an illusion that the human mind projects upon reality. And before you get too comfortable saying that, I want you to consider that maybe you are a heap. One way to put this is to say that you are a brain, and your brain, just like a heap, is made out of grains of sand, and just like a hairdo is made out of individual hairs, a brain is made out of individual cells. I could take 1 cell and remove it, you'd still have a brain. I could take 2 cells and remove it, you'd still have a brain. Or we could start at the other end of things. Instead of starting with a single grain of sand, we start with a single neuron. That's the basic cell, which makes up your whole nervous system, including your brain. 1 neuron would not be a brain, 2 neurons would not be a brain, 3 neurons would not be a brain. And you might say, this is too materialistic, Mandic. Let's talk in terms of souls or minds. Well, we could do the same thing. Your mind is made out of thoughts, or experiences, or thoughts and experiences. If you just had one, that wouldn't be a mind. If there was just one experience, the experience of like the color red, that's not a mind. If there was just one thought, that wouldn't be a mind. That would be, I don't know what that would be. That would be very weird. It certainly wouldn't be your mind or my mind. My mind is very complex. It's got all sorts of experiences and thoughts and memories. I could remove one, remove the second one, I can remove the third one and still have my mind. So one way of putting this is it would be very costly to deny that there are complex entities. It would be very costly to say that the only complex entities are ones that exist in the mind, because the mind itself might be a complex entity, and that would just be really paradoxical. Like one way to say it would be to say there's only neurons. Brains don't exist, or brains only exist insofar as brains think they exist. But wait a minute, so the brains are pulling themselves into existence? They're making themselves exist by thinking that they exist? Like, It's just nonsense. It doesn't make sense for these complexes to exist only in the mind. If the mind itself is a complex, that means that mind only exists insofar as the mind thinks it exists. It's a really big problem. And unfortunately, we don't have time for it. We have to go on to our next set of problems. And these are the most interesting ones. A lot of what we were talking about when we were talking about the puzzles of material constitution, they veered towards questions of persons. Like we could talk about a grain of sand and a heap, but isn't it really more interesting to talk about a brain that might be a person? And we could talk about a material object that has parts and survives getting some of its parts chopped off. But isn't it more interesting when we make it a person like Dion or Theon? So let's get into that. Let's get into people and the ways in which puzzles arise when we think about, number one, whether people can survive change. And number two, what the relationship is between people and their parts. And one of the sort of part that we're going to talk about are what you might ordinarily think of as parts. Those are spatial parts, like the left part and the right part, the top part, the bottom part. But there's also temporal parts, or at least arguably. We are familiar with the idea that at least some things have temporal parts. So take, for example, a song. A song is something that exists in time, and there's the beginning and the middle and the end. Same for like movies or stories. Or like a war. There's the early part of World War II and the later part. Those are temporal parts. Those are temporal entities. And maybe people are like that too. Maybe people aren't simply material things. Maybe people aren't simply three-dimensional objects that are wholly present in a single moment, but instead they are four-dimensional objects which have, in addition to their spatial parts, their temporal parts. And maybe this is the solution to a lot of the puzzles that we're going to raise. Anyway, we're going to be talking more about parts and also about change. What is the general outline of what we're going to do now? Right, so we're entering the second part, parts. The second part of the video, and that's about personal identity and survival. And that part is going to break down itself into three parts. So part 2 of the whole video has got its own little parts. Part 2.1, part 2.2, and part 2.3. So first we're going to talk about something called Leibniz law. Leibniz keeps coming up in this class and is going to keep coming up again and again. One of the greatest philosophers and perhaps just greatest thinker overall. He contributed a lot to mathematics, helped invent the calculus, contributed a lot to physics by way of that. Very influential on relativity theory in physics. And one of the things that Leibniz is really famous for is this logical principle concerning how to think about the meaning of identity. What does it mean when you say, for example, Mark Twain is Samuel Clemens? What does that mean? What does it mean to say that Mark Twain is one and the same person as Samuel Clemens? Mark Twain is just a pen name for this guy whose birth name was Samuel Clemens. What does it mean when you say that a thing is identical to a thing? What's the logic of that? And that's something called Leibniz law. And when you think about Leibniz law, you start to get into weird puzzles about how it can be true that there could be identity over time, especially if there's been any change during that time. So in this first part, we're going to raise like the main puzzle of survival. How can a person survive change? How can one and the same person be at two different times, even though they might have different properties at those two different times? That's the puzzle we're going to raise in this first part. In the second and third parts, we're going to look at two theories that try to deal with the puzzle or deal with the problem. There's going to be, in the second part, Locke's psychological continuity theory, and then finally in part 3, we're going to talk about something called Perdurantism. Oh, we got a lot to do. All right, so Leibniz and his principle of identity. So here's a logical law. If you think about like just the logic of identity statements, it makes a lot of sense. And one way we can put Leibniz law is to say, for any entity X and any entity Y, X and Y are identical. That is one and the same entity. If and only if X and Y have all of the same properties. So here's an example. Suppose there is a person in the class who is the tallest student in the class. Okay? Also, suppose there's a person in the class who is the oldest student in the class. All right? Now, you might wonder whether the tallest person in the class is the same person as the oldest student. It's possible that we're talking about two different students, or maybe we're actually talking about one student, that the student who's the oldest is also the tallest. That's possible, right? So one way we could phrase the question is whether the person who is the tallest is identical to the person who is the oldest. Now, being tall is a property, and being old is a different property. They're not one of the same properties, but the oldest person might be one of the same person as the tallest person. So now, how would you know if these were actually different people? How would you know whether the oldest person and the tallest person were two different people? Well, what if the oldest person was a redhead and the tallest person wasn't a redhead? That would cinch it. If one person had a property that the other one lacked, they wouldn't be the same person. Or another example might be one like the tallest person is 7 feet tall and the oldest person is only 5 feet tall, so therefore they're not the same person. One way we might try to summarize that in a very general and abstract way is just talk about X and Y. If there's any property that X has that Y lacks, then X and Y are not identical. They're not one and the same. So Leibniz law is a logical principle that is spelling out the conditions under which for any entity X and any entity Y, whether X and Y are identical, and vice versa, whether X and Y are instead distinct. And by identical and distinct, we mean one and the same or two different. Are they two different entities or are they one and the same entity? Well, they would be one and the same entity if they had all the same properties. On the other hand, if there's a property that one of them had that the other one lacked, they would have to be two distinct individuals. So that might seem super reasonable. Like you might say, yeah, that makes perfect sense of how identity is supposed to work. Think about the questions of identity that you might be interested in, for example, a criminal trial. You want to know whether the person who's been accused of the crime is identical to the person who committed the crime. And what if it turns out that the person who's accused of the crime is only 5 feet tall, and you've got overwhelming evidence that the person who committed the crime is 7.5 feet tall? Well, you might say that this person is innocent. The person who's accused is not one and the same as the person who actually did it. So it looks like the Leibniz law is very deeply ingrained in the way in which we think about identity in really serious life and death, criminal law sorts of cases, and maybe in life in general. But then this puzzle arises when we think about identity over time. We take for granted that people can change, and they could change perhaps even in really extreme ways. You look at anybody as an adult and compare them to a picture of themselves as a little kid, and you can see huge differences. And some people, you can see even greater differences. There are celebrities that have undergone surgeries, plastic surgeries and stuff, maybe done things to change the shape of their nose and change the color of their skin. And we nonetheless appreciate, or at least we think that it's still the same person. So Michael Jackson, back when he was performing with the Jackson 5, way before he recorded the Thriller album, is still Michael Jackson. He got all sorts of changes made to his face and to his body and to his skin. He did things that lots of us do, like growing up, and other things like getting a nose job. But he's still one of the same person, right? But now, if you bring Leibniz law into this, it's hard to see how that's possible. How can this person be one and the same as this person? And we could put it in a logic, in terms of the logical notation that fits into Leibniz law. So here's another person, or maybe another bunch of people, who knows. So let X equal Mandic in 1978, and let Y equal Mandic in 2012. That's a picture of me, or is it? That's a picture of somebody calling themselves Pete Mandic, was taken in 2012, and he's holding a French bulldog who called himself Dave. And by the way, I have a French bulldog named Dave. You might wonder whether Mandic in 2018 is identical to Mandic in 2012. Anyway, let's focus on Mandic from 1978 and Mandic in 2012. So Mandic in 1978, no facial hair. There's probably other changes too. I think I gained a couple 100 pounds since 1978. Probably back in 1978, I was not even 5 feet tall. Now I'm 6 feet tall. Lots of changes, lots and lots of changes. So let X equal Mandic in 1978. Let Y equal Mandic in 2012. Now, Y has properties that X lacks. It would seem to follow from Leibniz law that X is not one and the same as Y. But if X is a person and Y is a person, then these are two different people. They might have the same name, but they're not the same person. And we're not saying simply that this person changed. We're actually denying that it was one person that changed. We're saying that instead a second person was created. And you might say, well, that's unacceptable. Other people say, yeah, that's fine. Okay, I guess Leibniz law is so great, we're going to have to hold on to it. And then if we apply it over time, we're going to have to come to the conclusion that there's really no such thing as personal survival. That what's happening is that whenever there's any change, you're creating a whole new person. And there's been thousands of people in the past almost 50 years that are all named Peter John Mandic III. Thousands of them. And they kind of roughly mostly look the same. There's some big changes. Like some of them have beards and some of them don't. There's a lot of similarities too. You might say that, or you might say, no, this is messed up. Obviously, we're just talking about one dude, one person, and he used to be 8 years old. Back in 1978, he was 8 years old. And maybe we should get rid of Leibniz law or something. Well, what are we going to do to make sense of this? Assuming you want to make sense of things, what do we do to make sense of it all? How can we make sense of whether Leibniz law is compatible with people changing over time? Now, one thing you might do is to move towards a general philosophical view that we can call essentialism. So maybe instead of saying that any change of property makes a change of identity, maybe we have to distinguish essential properties from inessential properties. And as long as X and Y have all the essential properties, they are the same. So, yes, Mandic in 1978 and Mandic in 2013. Those 2012, 2013, who cares? Mandic in 2013 and Mandic in 1978. There's a lot of properties that are different between them, like one's got a beard and one doesn't. But that's not essential to being a particular person, that you have particular facial hair. That's not essential. You might say Mandic in 2018 is wearing glasses and Mandic in 2013 doesn't have glasses. But that's not essential to being a person. But what is essential? What is the essence of Mandic? It's not his hair. It's not his just rugged good looks. It's his mind. It's his intellect. It is his brain. Now, what if we took my brain and put it in a blender and made a brain smoothie out of it? Well, now it's not Mandic anymore. It's a bunch of Mandic's molecules, but it's not Mandic anymore. You've now lost his essential properties because you've lost his intellect and his personality. But just changing his facial hair is only changing inessential properties. So maybe that's one way to do it. But that raises questions of like, well, what are the essential properties for a person? And one version of that, one of the most famous ones, is the one we get from the philosopher John Locke, who says the essential properties for a person has to do with their psychological properties. So your belly button is not. It doesn't really matter what your belly button is. It's possible you go get surgery and make your outie into an innie, and you'd still be you. But if we did something like to your mind, like or if you think of your mind as your brain, we could put it in terms of the brain. If we took your brain and we put it in a different body, like in the famous Frankenstein story, they dug up this corpse and they found some brain, and they put the brain from the one body into another body, and then zapped it with a lightning bolt and had this thing. Or you might imagine, like, we take my brain out and we throw it away, and we take your brain out and put it in my body. Do you survive? If you say yes, you survive. You go where your brain goes. Then you would agree with Locke that you would have a continuity of the psychological properties. So the brain swap helps us illustrate the psychological continuity theory of John Locke. Although we can put this in a non-materialist way of just like a soul. So like imagine there's a prince and there's a cobbler, and the soul of the prince goes into the body of the cobbler and vice versa. Where is the cobbler? Is the cobbler stay with the body, or does the cobbler go with the soul? Or if we do a brain swap, like we've got Mrs. Turner and Timmy, and they get their brains swapped, and suppose Mrs. Turner's body and Timmy's brain are destroyed. Question, which one survives? Well, you might say it's Mrs. Turner who survives. As long as her brain survives, she survives. She's going to spend the rest of her life trapped in Timmy's body, unless she gets a new body. But she goes where the brain goes. And why is the brain important? Because the brain is the organ of the body that creates the psychological properties, things like your intellect and your intelligence and your personality. And those are the essential properties for you to maintain your identity. Now, there's a whole host of problem cases that arise that are raised as objections to the psychological continuity theory. And one sort is what we could call fission problems. One sort of problem that you could raise for Locke's theory are problems of fission. Fission is, you might be familiar with the term fission in the phrase nuclear fission, when you take the nucleus of an atom and you split it, as in you would an atomic reactor where you're splitting uranium atoms or plutonium atoms. That's fission. Splitting is what you're talking about. And we could talk about other kinds of splitting too, and raise puzzle cases for Locke's psychological continuity theory. One sort of splitting scenario has to do with a brain split. Some of you might be familiar with the idea that you can take half of your brain and surgically remove it. And, I mean, you probably couldn't do the surgery yourself, but doctors could do the surgery, remove half of your brain and throw it away, and you would still survive. You might be familiar with that idea. It's something that actually does happen. There are people that have had such severe cases of epilepsy that the only treatment for it was to remove the parts of the brain where the epileptic seizures were emanating from. And in some very extreme cases, they would get 1/2 of their brain removed. And nonetheless, that person, in some sense, survived. Now that raises the following puzzle case. Suppose we took the left half of my brain and put it in one body, and the right half of my brain and put it in another body. If a person can survive with just a half of a brain, then each one of those halves would be individually sufficient for the survival of Mandic. But now Mandic survives in two bodies. Mandic would have two bodies. One body has the original right half of the brain, and the other body has the original left half. Or we could put the example like this. Suppose we've got 3 people starting off. And we got Mo, Curly, and Larry. And Curly, the one in the middle, he gets his brain destroyed. We take his brain out and we feed it to an alligator and then throw the alligator into a volcano. And then we take half of Mo's brain and half of Larry's brain, and we put them in Curly's body. And then we take the leftovers from Mo and Larry and we throw them in the volcano with the alligators. Okay, who survives? Does Curly survive and he just happens to have like he received donor brain pieces from his brothers Mo and Larry? Or does Mo and Larry both survive in Curly? What would Locke say? Locke would say that we've got two people, neither one of them is Curly. Mo and Larry both survive, but they now survive in one and the same body. You might say that's really weird. That's really puzzling. Or, there's another sort of version of this where you take the right brain and the left brain and you put them in two separate bodies. So we go in the other direction. We take out Mo's brain, throw it away. Larry's brain, throw it away. Take Curly's brain, cut it in half, put one over here, one half over here. But now Curly survives in two different places. You might say, that's weird. You can't have one person be in two places at the same time. But Locke's theory would entail that you can have that. So this would be an objection to Locke's theory. Another version of this, one of the, I like a lot better. I just think it's more interesting. But you might like the brain surgery version better. That's fine. Brings in teletransporters like from Star Trek or other science fiction, where you've got a material transport system. You scan a person with something kind of like a copy machine, only it's able to get a high resolution 3D image of every molecule in their body. And then based on that information, you create an electronic blueprint that you could beam over a far distance. You could basically send a fax of an entire human being. You could email yourself somewhere. This is an efficient way of travel because radio waves don't weigh very much, and you can get them to go to the speed of light without burning a lot of energy. Where if we had to transport your body at the speed of light, it'd probably take as much energy as exists in the whole universe, and it's not very practical. So we scan your body, we send radio waves describing the positions of your molecules. We beam that to Mars. Over on Mars, they receive the radio transmission, and then based on the blueprints and a new set of molecules, they assemble a thing that looks just like the original body. And it walks and talks and even thinks that it's Pete Mandic. But is it Pete Mandic? What if at the receiver station they accidentally pressed print twice? We would have two copies of you, each of which says, like if they did it to me, each one of them would say, I'm Pete Mandic. And each one of them would remember being Pete Mandic. Each one of them would have all of Pete Mandic's memories and personality and make all the same choices if presented with the same stimuli. Does Pete Mandic now exist in two different locations? According to Locke's continuity theory, right, X is identical to Y if X remembers being Y. Well, each one of those things that came out of the receiver station would remember being Pete Mandic. So they are each Pete Mandic? That seems really weird. We could put it in a way that makes it look like it's an objection. But just to get really clear about how teletransportation is supposed to work in this hypothetical scenario, we've got a sender station and a receiver station. At the sender station, a person's molecules are scanned and a blueprint of the person is sent in the form of radio waves to the receiver station. At the sender station, a person's molecules are torn apart and saved in a tank for later use. At the receiver station, the blueprint is used to assemble a person out of an entirely different collection of molecules. Might be reminding you of the ship of Theseus a little bit. Now, according to Locke's theory, could you be teletransported to Mars even though your original molecules got left behind? It seems like the answer should be yes, because the new set of molecules is going to have this memory. They're going to remember having been on Mars. There's a continuity of memory, a continuity of this psychological process. Even though it's a physically distinct collection of molecules, it's still you. you still survive. But here's a way to try to make an objection against Locke's theory of identity by appealing to a hypothetical teletransporter, especially a teletransporter malfunction. Again, we're going to be talking about a logical principle of identity. This one is slightly different from Leibniz law. This is something known as the transitivity of identity. This is an intuitively obvious logical principle I think most people would accept. If x is identical to y and y is identical to z, then x is identical to z. It's transitive. If being identical, one thing is being identical to something else is transitive. Some things in life are transitive and some are not. So like take, for example, being above. If I'm above you and you are above George, then I am above George. So aboveness is transitive. Other things are not transitive. Like, for example, holding hands. If I'm holding hands with you and you're holding hands with George, I'm not necessarily holding hands with George. No offense, George. Just not necessarily holding your hand. So holding hands with is not transitive, but being above is transitive. And it turns out identity is also transitive. So that's our first premise of the argument, the logical principle of the transitivity of identity. The second premise says, now suppose we've got X, and it's a lady who enters the sender station, and Y and Z are the ladies that come out of the receiver station. So at the receiver station, someone pressed print twice, and we have entities Y and Z. Now, according to Locke's theory, we're in premise 3 now, Y and Z are each identical to X since each remembers being X. Now, according to the transitivity of identity, Y and Z are identical. Because of the transitivity, if Y is identical to X and Z is identical to X, it would follow then that Y is identical to Z. But that seems absurd, that you can have Y and Z be identical. If Y and Z are identical, then Y and Z are just one and the same person. But that seems really weird. Like, take a clear example where Y and Z are one and the same person. Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens. If Mark Twain stands on a scale and Samuel Clemens stands on a scale at the same time, you're going to get the same reading as when Mark Twain stands on the scale. If it's going to be true, if Mark Twain stands on a scale, it's going to say 180 pounds. And it's going to be true that if Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens stand on a scale at the same time, that one scale is going to say 180 pounds. However, if Y and Z stand on a scale, it's going to read double what it would read if just Y stood on the scale. Y and Z weigh twice as much as Y alone. So it looks like, at least on that criterion, Y and Z are not one and the same person. So either Locke's theory is false or the transitivity of identity is false, is the conclusion of this argument. And now you might say, the transitivity of identity is just so solid, it can't be false. Now we've got an additional step, and the conclusion to that enhanced argument would be that Locke's theory is false. Okay, so we've taken a look at one theory of personal identity, how identity might work over time. We're going to look at another theory of personal identity. This is something known as Perdurantism. One way of thinking about Perdurantism is to relate it to B theories. Perdurantism is a natural conclusion about personal identity you would get if you start off having a B theory about time. And you recall from lecture 13, B theories of time were things like eternalism or four-dimensionalism. Theories of time where the most basic language that best captures time without leaving anything out is tenseless. You could have tensed language, but you don't need it. Nothing would be left out if you used only tenseless language in describing time. It's tempting then to say, on a B theory, all moments in time, past, present, future, are equally real. They're equally valid from a metaphysical point of view. So what does it mean for there to be personal identity? What does it mean for there to be identity over time? Well, one way to put it is that what a person is a four-dimensional space-time entity. A person isn't just the sort of thing that it could exist only in the present. In contrast, if you were a presentist and you thought there were people, you would have to say that people exist only in the present, because that's the only time they could exist. But for a four-dimensionalist or an eternalist, people are smeared out over time. Now, I want you to get a good sense of what it means for people to be smeared out over time, or in order for one way to think about it is for people to be space-time worms. So, simplifying the spatial dimensions as just two dimensions, x and y, and saving the third dimension for time, we could think of a person over time as like this smeared out entity. And this smeared out entity, this entity that is elongated along the t dimension, is what I'm calling, and what others have called, a space-time worm. So here's another representation of a space-time worm. This is a person over their entire lifetime. So right somewhere in the middle, they are a young adult. A little bit later, they're an old man with a cane. I think this is a grave or a tomb, a casket with a grave marker. Anyway, they're dead at this one end of the space-time worm. And on this other end of the space-time worm, they've just been born. They're a little bitty baby. So they start off real small, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they get osteoporosis and they shrink, and eventually they die from heart failure. But what a person is this whole thing, this whole space-time worm. And what's here and now is just a space-time slice. We are going to take a quick look at a movie that contains a lot of cool stuff in it. It's going to give us a sense of the way in which the B theories of time connect to Einsteinian relativity theory. But my main interest in having you see this video is to just get a good visual reference for what it means to think about space-time worms, and to think about the whole of space and time as a single entity within which exist these space-time worms. And what you think of yourself here and now is just a slice of one of those space-time worms. So we're going to watch a quick video about space-time worms and the space-time loaf. I gotta smoke up my pipe and drink my water. And when I'm done, you guys are gonna be done with the movie. All right, see you in a little bit.
Than an illusion.
A bad idea. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed the movie and you got an idea now of what I mean when I talk about space-time worms. And let's get back to endurantism and perdurantism. So perdurantism is this theory of personal identity that we're talking about right now. And we're going to contrast it with endurantism. And one way of thinking about the contrasting theories is that we've got an A theory over here. Endurantism is like an A theory of personal identity. And perdurantism is a B theory of personal identity. For endurantism, a person is just wholly present in the here and now. A person is a three-dimensional entity that is wholly present in the current moment. Where for perdurantists, a person is smeared out over time. They don't simply exist in just a single moment. So take, for example, like my uttering the word asparagus. That doesn't exist at just a point in time. If it did, it would sound like this. Beep. But it's something that is spread out over time, the way like a melody is spread out over time, or the viewing of a movie is spread out over time. According to a perdurantist, a person is spread out over time. The things that really, truly exist are four-dimensional space-time worms. And so-called three-dimensional objects are just these artificial slices, time slices or temporal slices of those four-dimensional entities. So how does this help us understand the puzzling case of survival or identity over time? Well, on endurantism, you get the problem. Perdurantism solves the problem. So with endurantism, you get X equals Mandic in 1978, Y equals Mandic in 2012. But if Mandic is wholly present at a single time, then Mandic can't be like, if Mandic is at 2012, then Mandic cannot be at 1978. One and the same person can't be at two different times. whatever is at two different times would have to be two different people, or maybe the earlier time isn't even real, or something like that. So the earlier person isn't real. You get these weird puzzle cases with endurantism, but if you switch over to perdurantism, you can make the puzzles go away. So you might say 1978 Mandic and 2012 Mandic are distinct entities, but they're not distinct people. They're not distinct persons. 1978 Mandic is just a time slice of one worm. 2012 Mandic is another time slice of one and the same worm. When you say Mandic used to be 4 feet tall, what you're saying is that Mandic has a 4-foot time slice in 1978. In 2012, Mandic has a 6-foot time slice. It's one and the same person that had different heights because it's one and the same space-time worm that had different slices. One of the advantages of perdurantism over, say, for example, Locke's identity theory is that we don't have to pick any specific essential features. A person could survive all sorts of changes, like, for example, getting their memory completely wiped out. There's all sorts of things that I don't remember about my childhood, but it's still true that I used to be that child, even though I don't remember any of it. That seems like a harder case to deal with for the Locke's psychological continuity theory. How can I be identical to an entity that I don't remember anymore? There's no psychological continuity. Okay, that was a lot of material. So let's just think about some questions to ask about it and study those questions. So here we go. Study questions about material constitution and personal identity over time. Study question number 1. Hypothetical fission scenarios pose a problem for Locke's psychological theory of personal identity because A, they involve two distinct people who, according to Locke, would be identical to a third, which is absurd. B, they point out a tension between Locke's memory criterion of personal identity and the logical principle of the transitivity of identity. C, they assume the doctrine of no self, the Buddhist view of Anatman. D, both A and B. E, none of the above. Study question 2. According to the teletransporter malfunction argument, A, if a person had more than one clone, only the first clone would have free will. B, if you split your brain in half and donate one half to charity, you could declare the subsequent loss of IQ on your tax return. C, the transitivity of identity is the logical principle that if X is married to Y and Y is taller than Z, then either X has a mustache or Z is a doctor. D, both A and B. E, none of the above. Study question 3. Jane is the tallest graduate of this school. However, Jane has red hair, and the tallest graduate of this school does not have red hair. Which logical principle would this contradict? A, the transitivity of identity. B, the attraction of opposites. C, the principle of bivalence. D, the law of non-contradiction. E, Leibniz law. And the answers to the study questions. The answer to study question 1 was D. The answer to study question 2 was E. And the answer to study question 3 was also E. And that brings us to the end of this lecture. This lecture is now over. It is not going to exist anymore. This is the end. Okay, we're not done with metaphysics yet, but that's the end of material objects and the identity of persons over time. Until next time, I am Dr. Mandic. Talk to you later. Keep on surviving.